Hi everyone, my name is Gavin Ploger. I am a third-year PhD student in Communication and Media at University of Michigan. I'm here presenting some research I've done on polarization in the United States over the last year or so. Now, academic concerns about political polarization are nothing new. You're probably familiar with some of the work investigating ideological polarization and affective polarization. However, my focus here is on perceived polarization, that is, the perception that the parties and the people in them are divided either ideologically or affectively. Recent studies have suggested that people perceive Republicans and Democrats as dramatically more divided than they actually are, and that perceptions of polarization are growing much faster than real polarization. Moreover, these studies find that perceptions of polarization may have some important negative consequences for political behavior. However, some of this work has been sort of agnostic to the target of these perceptions, that is, partisans, political elites, or the parties themselves, and to the type of polarization that people perceive, that is, ideological or affective. That means that respondents in prior studies might have been thinking about affectively polarized voters or ideologically polarized politicians. So part of the contribution of my work here is that I attempt to disentangle these concepts, starting by investigating specifically perceptions of ideological polarization and affective polarization among partisan voters. On the slide, I've put one of the questions tapping perceived ideological polarization to give you a sense of my target. Now, this previous work that I've mentioned demonstrates that one of the strongest correlates of perceived polarization is news use, and that depictions of polarization are quite common in the news. Given these findings, the intuition in the literature is that people learn their perceptions of polarization from the news. Essentially, the argument is that people use the news to make inferences about the state of the country in line with, for example, Mutz's theory of impersonal influence. This leads me to my first hypothesis, which is confirmation of previous experimental results. Now, news coverage of polarization usually involves exemplification. Exemplification is the news practice of using individual people, or exemplars, to frame news stories. Because exemplification is so common in the news coverage of polarization, most existing work argues that exemplification is a key driver of perceived polarization. Implicit in this exemplification hypothesis is the idea that coverage of polarization interacts with the use of exemplification, such that news coverage of polarization that uses exemplification causes greater perceived polarization in the audience. This leads me to my second hypothesis. Now, I argue that there has been no direct test of the exemplification hypothesis, despite it being examined by a couple of previous studies, because neither of the studies that look at it directly examine exemplification and separate it from polarization. Thus, neither study can specifically test this interaction and leave unclear the role of exemplification in creating perceived polarization. Now, I've talked a little bit about what drives perceptions of polarization, but it also has political consequences. Some past correlational work demonstrates that perceived polarization is actually very strongly associated with political participation. In fact, it is more strongly associated with political participation than are either ideological or affective polarization. However, there's no causal evidence to this point. As such, the last aim of this study is to experimentally explore the effects of perceived polarization on political participation. To investigate these questions, I used an online survey experiment with about 1,700 participants from Dynata. Participants were shown one news vignette, or the control, and the news vignettes were randomly assigned using a 2x2 factorial design that lets me test the different combinations of polarized stories and exemplification. To analyze the findings from this design, I use an OLS model of perceived polarization regressed on treatment, with treatment defined as a factor so that each coefficient in the model captures the difference between the respective treatment and the control. I find that exposure to polarized news increases perceived polarization, but that this effect is only marginally significant. Broken down by the type of polarization, I find a significant effect on perceptions of ideological polarization, but no effect on perceptions of affective polarization. On the right, I show the model for perceived ideological polarization. Overall, this serves as partial evidence for my first hypothesis. For my second hypothesis, I find no evidence of the hypothesized polarization by exemplification interaction. In other words, variation in perceived polarization was largely associated with variation in the polarization covered in the vignettes, and had nothing to do with whether the vignette included exemplification or not. To analyze indirect effects, I estimated a mediation model in R with perceived polarization as the mediator and intent to participate in politics as the dependent variable. I find that exposure to polarized news has a significant positive effect on perceived polarization, which then has a significant negative effect on intent to participate in politics. In other words, I find that exposure to polarized news decreases intent to participate in politics indirectly through increased perceived ideological polarization. Note that this effect, this indirect effect, is significant also if I look at just voting rather than this broader index of intent to participate in politics. In summary, I find that exemplification is not an adequate explanation for perceptions of polarization. Instead, inference seems to be the driving force. People learn from news and apply that to their beliefs. Second, exposure to polarized news does reduce participation, but the mechanism for this effect remains unclear. It's reasonable to say that perceived polarization have some things in common with some of the literatures on negativity, incivility, and disagreement. And empirically, the closest match between my findings and those literatures is to some of the work on disagreement that finds that disagreement can demobilize. But it's not clear that disagreement is the appropriate conceptual match for these findings. For the time being, I regard my work as evidence that polarization may have some unique effects not captured or predicted by these other literatures. But in future work, I plan to more carefully explore the relationships between perceived polarization and these related concepts. Now, within the work on perceived polarization, my finding that perceived polarization decreases participation conflicts with some prior work. The expectation of a positive relationship between these perceptions and participation is from correlational work, and it may be that there are other important variables at play in the real world that I've removed here with this experiment. Additionally, as I said at the outset, the way I'm measuring perceived polarization is quite different from all past work in this area. The effect I find is mediated by perceptions of ideological differences between Democratic and Republican voters. Respondents in previous studies might have been thinking about politicians or parties as a whole instead, and it may be that those have distinct effects not captured here. Finally, I find some possible indirect effects on issue positions and on affective polarization. They are a little bit more complicated than I have time to get into here, but if you're curious about them, I'm happy to respond if you shoot me an email or a message on the platform. With these notes in mind, I'd like to spend a moment discussing some of the substantive and normative implications of these findings. Now, as you may have noticed from the results I showed earlier, these effects are quite small. However, they may be substantively significant. Participants described the stories and the people in them as moderately typical, and we know from prior research that news stories depicting polarization are increasingly common. Given that people may be exposed to these stories on a daily or weekly basis, there's plenty of time for even small effects to accumulate over repeated exposures. Normatively, I also want to call attention to the importance of political participation. Insofar as we want to preserve the public's willingness to participate, we need to take perceived polarization seriously. Participation is the critical path by which members of the public can make their voices heard to their representatives. And if that is being impinged on, we need to take some care to theorize it and study it. Finally, it's important to note that although my study was conducted in the United States, perceptions of polarization are widespread internationally. This is not just a problem for the United States, and it's not just a problem for scholars studying the US. We need to consider this in comparative perspective to understand how perceptions of polarization relate to political participation across the globe. On that note, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present here, not least because I'm eager to hear your reactions to the argument I presented. Please let me know if you think I've left anything out, or if the elements of my argument could be strengthened. Thank you again.